I'm back again today to share more of my top 100 fantasy books. Today, 80 through 61. More great books to possibly end up on your TBR. Let's see what I've got. Hi there, welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where father and son talk about fantasy, science fiction, other nerdy things we enjoy. Just Jim, the father of this show, here with you today because I'm back to continue my top 100 fantasy books that I've read. I've worked so hard to put this list together. It's kind of agony to figure out which one really is better than another, and it's very subjective. You're getting to see what I think about books and how I classify what makes a book great. I'm not trying to say these are literally the best books of all time. They are my best fantasy books of all the ones that I've read. And I stand by my list as being some terrific books. So here I am, part two. I'm starting at number 80 and working my way up to 61. If you did not catch part one, you're missing 100 through 81. Let's see, I think click here. I'll try to drop that in, and you could jump right back to that episode first. But now that I assume you've seen it, let's go on and get to the list. Number 80 is a book I almost cringe to put in here, but that's mostly because of how it ends. And I'm talking about The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. This came out in 2008, and there's nothing wrong with the first book. It's an amazing story. This is just an example of a trilogy where the author didn't know how to land the plane. It's a pretty bumpy collapse at the finish, my opinion. But the first book, fantastic, gripping, heartbreaking. Oh my goodness, the stuff they put those young people through. So I consumed it so hard, so fast. And then the movie comes out eventually, and that first movie was pretty good too. So, number 80. Number 79. We're gonna stay in the realm of stuff that's tough to read, perhaps a little hard to consume, because this is grimdark. I'm going to book two of Mark Lawrence's The Broken Empire trilogy. This would be King of Thorns. This came out in 2012. I've already talked about the first book from the trilogy, which was fantastic, but King of Thorns, even better. Number 78 on my list, Words of Radiance. Book 2 of Brandon Sanderson's The Stormlight Archive, what many people consider the best material he's written to date. Words of Radiance came out in 2014. You're not going to find book 1 anywhere on this list. Book 1, The Way of Kings, is a good book. It's a fine book. For me, I struggled with it. It does not make the top 100. It's not even close to the top 100. But Words of Radiance, well, that comes in at number 78. It's down here because I still struggled getting into it at the beginning. It's a little slow. I felt it had pacing issues. I look forward to rereading it. I think it's going to be better and will probably rise, therefore, for next year's version of this list. But for now, number 78. Number 77, 11/22/63, a novel by Stephen King. This came out in 2011, and it was one of the best Stephen King books in a long time. It is fantasy, it's a little sci-fi because we're talking about time travel here. And what if you could go, it's a question we always ask. What if you could go back in time and kill Adolf Hitler as a baby? What would happen? That's not what happens in the story because this is not full spoilers at all here, people. But it does touch on what if you could go back in time and change things. It's a touching story. It's touches the heart. It's moving. It's also a little there's some freaky, questionable things happening here. It's borderline fantasy, like a lot of Stephen King's books are, but it's definitely fantastic to read and worthy of my top 100. Number 76, let's return to Harry Potter again. This time, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Book 5 by J.K. Rowling, of course, published in 2003. I've already had the Goblet of Fire on here, where things turned darker Order of the Phoenix, things get more militaristic. Militaristic is maybe the wrong word, but we've got people taking sides now. We've got the forces of the bad coming out of the woodwork now. There's no hiding. Voldemort's here. They don't want to say his name still, but he's around, and the impact is felt. This book has that amazing scene near the end that is so sorrowful for Harry, for what it means for him, and for many others. A massive confrontation that is written really well. So there you go. Number 76. Number 75, The Way of Shadows. The Night Angel Trilogy, Book 1 by Brent Weeks. This came out in 2008. I love the Night Angel Trilogy. This is where the story starts. It's got an innocence to it. Some characters that are somewhat naive. They're written that way. And yet there's some heavy stuff that happens here. And Durzo Blint, man. That's all I got to say. So there you go. That one's 75. Number 74. Let's go back to the Pern books by Anne McCaffrey. This time, Dragon's Eye, which is book 13 of the series, written in 1996. Dragon's Eye is telling a bit about how we, jumping back in time. That's part of what happens with the Pern books. You don't just all get things right at the one initial time series, but we're going back to different periods of the history of the story and seeing how the world changed due to the threat of Thread. If you've read Pern, you know what I'm talking about there. And so I really appreciate Dragon's Eye and this first story of how they have adapted after a passing of time without being in danger. And now they have to deal with it again. Number 73, Book 2 of Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles. This is The Vampire Lestat, which came out in 1985. There's a chunk of time between Interview with the Vampire and The Vampire Lestat, in which time Anne Rice had really got her mind around some of this stuff. Much better. The Vampire Lestat is way better, in my opinion. This character, Lestat, to have the whole book centered around his story now, is gripping, is fantastic, is so rich. There's so much to it. Really love this book, and that's why it's even higher on my list at 73. 72, finally, people, we're getting some zombie books here. Okay, Zombie Apocalypse has to be on my list. But I'll admit it, there's a lot of zombie apocalyptic stuff that's not good enough to be up here with the big boys of fantasy. This one is. I'm talking about World War Z, An Oral History of the Zombie War by Max Brooks, published in 2006. You may have seen the movie. Forget the movie. It's barely connected to the book, and the book is tremendously better. It really gives you a way to picture a real-life zombie apocalypse coming out and trying to figure out just what happened, because the entire book is told in flashback. The war is over. Now they're trying to put the pieces together through interviews of people who survived. What did they experience? How did it all break down? It's so realistically written. I just really enjoy this book. It's one of the best zombie books I've read. Second best. I have one more coming. Number 71, back to Shannara, and this is The Wish Song of Shannara, Book 3, by Terry Brooks, published in 1985. Now, I had previously the Elf Stones of Shannara, which is where I said this is where it really gets going. Well, The Wish Song of Shannara follows right after it and says, okay, now that we're really going, let's go even further. The Wish Song. Just this concept that Terry Brooks comes up with is transformative to what we're going to see in the rest of the Shannara series. It's so fascinating what he has done, from starting with the Elf Stones, creating this thing that's the Wish Song, and seeing how it's going to impact generations of people. I don't want to tell you more, but this story by itself is terrific. Number 70, we're up to another 10 set. Number 70, I'm going back to Pern. Sorry, I love these Pern books, and a lot of them are good enough to be in my top 100. So this time it's Dragon's Song, which is book 3 in the Pern series in the order, the publication order they came out, 1976. It's also book 1 of the Harper Hall of Pern, a initial trilogy that's part of the whole series. This one introduces you to Menely, one of the dearest characters that you know in all of Pern, and her backstory. It also helps us to truly fall in love with fire lizards. These adorable little things that are just such characters. One might think of them as pets, but they're far more than pets. The relationship that we get to see between Menely and fire lizards is something that touches the heart a bit, but it also gives us another context on the world of Pern, different from what we see in the initial books that introduce us to the story. And I really appreciated the different perspective. In fact, that's number 70. I appreciated the experience so much that number 69 is the next book in the series, Dragon Singer, which is a direct follow-up from Dragon's Song. It's still focused on Menely, but it's kind of like Menely meets Harry Potter. She's going to school and she's going to train in the Harper Hall. This book was the very next year. Anne McCaffrey dropped it in 1977, and they are a 1-2 punch. Dragon Song, Dragon Singer. They belong together. They tell just this endearing story of Menely and the people she interacts with, the way she grows in confidence, and what becomes of her, how she ends up transforming Pern. Number 68, Shadow's Edge. Back to the Night Angel trilogy. This is book 2 by Brent Weeks again, published in 2008. The Fantasy Files podcast, Spencer, over there, friend of ours, friend of the show, been on our show. He's the one that introduced me to the Night Angel trilogy. Thought I would really enjoy it. He was right. Book 2 is a step up from book 1. We get a little more gritty, a little darker, a little less naive, as we see our primary character, Kylar, debating how to pronounce his name, how he's changing through the experiences he's going through, as well as the way the people around him are being impacted. A great fantasy story, especially if you don't mind a little bit of a focus on people who make sure that people who need to be dead end up dead. Number 67, The Living Dead, the most recent book that I've read, and it ends up on this list. This is Zombie Apocalypse again, written by George A. Romero. He did not finish it in life, so his estate got Daniel Kraus to take the book and bring it to completion. It was published in 2020. I just found it a few months ago and just read it. It is the best serious zombie apocalypse book I have ever read. It's really kind of like written in two different styles. The first half of the book is the zombie apocalypse as it happens, and the second half of the book is jump ahead in time, now a focus on the survivors, who most of whom we met in the early part, and how they're trying to be the restart of civilization and all that they've been through. We pick up a bunch of that through interviews, similar, to World War Z, but yet quite different, its own fresh, unique thing. Really does some different things here than you see in other zombie stories. So I really appreciated The Living Dead. Number 66, Book 1 of George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. We're talking about A Game of Thrones, published in 1996. This was a jaw-dropping book for me as I see fantasy in a way that I'd not encountered before. Dark, gritty, R, sometimes maybe X rated. I mean, some heavy, dark, adult level stuff. You do not share this with your child. You do not share this with your preteen. They need to be a little more mature to handle the kind of content that's coming at you in A Game of Thrones. We owe a lot to A Game of Thrones and George R.R. Martin, because, of course, this became the HBO series, which proved we could take serious fantasy content, put it on the screen, and dominate the culture. And now we're getting so much more because of it. So, whoop, love it. It's number 66 on my list. Number 65. Let's get some Joe Abercrombie in here. That's right. First Law, Book 2, Before They Are Hanged. This came out in 2007. This is true grimdark, where no good deed goes unpunished. I'll tell you right now, all 3 books of the original First Law trilogy are on my top 100. This is the lowest of them because book 2, it's a great story, but there are parts in the middle that kind of drag a little for me. Just a little. And it's certainly made up for with a lot of the other parts of the story. And oh my goodness, the stuff that's happening down in that southern continent. That's the great stuff of this story. It's just not all at that level, unfortunately. So it's the lowest of the 3. You'll have to wait to see where I put the other 2. Number 64, my first Malazan entry, Knight of Knives. It's actually an Ian C. Esselmont story published in 2004. This is the first Esselmont book that came along, I believe. It is the first Esselmont I read, and I loved it. I thought Knight of Knives was a fantastic addition to the series as I've been reading it. I'm only through 8 books of the core Malazan Book of the Fallen at this point, but reading Knight of Knives where I did just really enriched the story, added some details I hadn't gotten a chance to understand before or really see up front and close. Loved Knight of Knives. Number 63, The Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson. We got some Mistborn here for us. This came out in 2016. The Bands of Mourning is the 3rd book in Era 2 of Mistborn. So the 6th Mistborn book overall. It's a great story. I enjoy The Bands of Mourning. There's just some charm to this book. There's also things that are revealed in here that I appreciate, and advancement of a couple of key characters who have a relationship, if you understand what I'm talking about, really makes this much more entertaining than some of the books before it. So The Bands of Mourning, number 63. Number 62, Malice, The Faithful and the Fallen, Book 1 by John Gwynne, published in 2012. I struggled with Malice the first time I tried because I read it as an audiobook. There's so much to this massive epic fantasy book that I got lost. I had to start over. And then in the second try, I got lost and had to start over a third time. But the third time, the stuff started to make sense and click, and I'm glad I persisted because this book is incredible. And it's an incredible start to a 4-book series that blows my mind. You'll hear me talk about more books from The Faithful and the Fallen in this list, but because I struggled with Malice a bit to get going, it's the lowest of the books at 62. My final book for you today, 61, is The White Dragon, Dragon Riders of Pern, Book 5, or the final book of the original Dragon Riders of Pern trilogy by Anne McCaffrey, again, published in 1978. There's nothing wrong with The White Dragon. It's a great story. It's just in comparison to other books, it comes out at number 61 and below a few other Dragon Riders of Pern books that you'll still hear about. But not today. That's where I'm stopping. Let me know what you think of numbers 61 through 80. Any surprises in here? Any you would put in different order? Anything you're still waiting for and wondering, Jim, where are these books? You'll find out more as we keep going because I'll be back with part 3 tomorrow. But for today, thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.